who, whenever I discuss Bakhmut, come back and say, well, it hasn't been very impressive. The Russians have taken so long to capture this small isolated town of Bakhmut, which has no strategic significance, and this doesn't really show the Russian military in very good light. I have repeatedly said that I don't agree. I think the prolongation of the Battle of Bakhmut has worked to the Russian advantage, not to the Ukrainian. On the contrary, I think Ukraine's overinvestment in the defense of Bakhmut has been disastrous, and the United States thinks so, apparently. So do many officials in Europe, military officials in Europe, and certainly that's my view. But if you wanted to make that criticism, if you wanted to make criticism that the Russians have made heavy weather of one particular place, then the right place to do it is not Bakhmut, where I think the Russian operations, spearheaded by the Wagner organization, so far as I can judge, and remember I'm no expert in these things, have been incremental, methodical, and very effective. If you wanted to make that kind of criticism, then the right place to do it is in Marinka. Now, I say that I don't know very much about the nature of the battle in Marinka, but certainly it's been the case that the Russians have given an over-optimistic spin repeatedly of their progress in that particular town, and they have made very heavy weather of it. But anyway, supposedly, and again, in light of these premature claims of victory in the past, I take this now with a cascade of salt, a mountain of salt. But anyway, we're getting reports that this tyre factory has now been captured, and that it does seem as if these reports are true, and I expect that they are about the tyre factory at least, that the Battle of Marinka, this long, slow, grinding battle, is finally coming to some kind of conclusion. In and around Vuhledar, a more difficult place, a very difficult place to capture by all accounts. Apparently there's been a lot of fighting backwards and forwards. Ukraine has launched several counterattacks on Russian positions. They've been repelled. The Russians supposedly are incrementally working to advance around Vuhledar. But the key point to make is that the Russian Air Force is now definitely operating actively around Vuhledar. This is now widely confirmed, and it seems clear that the battle for Vuhledar, with Russian aviation now working, that might start to take a different turn again in a short while, perhaps after Bakhmut falls. I am going to say one further point about Vuhledar. Vuhledar and Marinka, one of the reasons why Ukraine has probably clung on to these places so determinedly, and with some effect, is because if the Russians do capture these two places, it will, my understanding of the geography is correct, and of the transport, the railway networks is correct, if that does indeed happen, then of course the entire project of a Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye region would be put in question. And now that brings me both to the question of the Ukrainian counteroffensive and to this big document dump. Now, I've made it clear in previous videos that I believe these documents are real. Now, when I made those claims, because of the time constraints under which I work, I'd not had opportunities to read what had been written by others, and in particular, I had not had an opportunity to read Larry Johnson at Sonar 21. And Sonar 21, for those who don't know, son of the American Revolution, 21, written by Larry Johnson, is an indispensable blog about the war. And Larry Johnson is, of course, a former CIA analyst. He's familiar with American internal documentation, which of course I am not. And he's looked at these documents and he has absolutely no doubt at all about their authenticity. And I consider his expert view on this conclusive. Now, I realize there are lots of other people who think otherwise, but from everything that Larry Johnson says, and I find his comments on this, as I said, authoritative and definitive, he thinks these are authentic documents. To my eye, they look authentic as well, and I think we should all accept that these documents are indeed authentic. There's some suggestions that some of these documents have been manipulated, some of their contents have been manipulated. I am very skeptical about that as well. There's reports from various sides that these are all part of a disinformation exercise, either by the US to deceive the Russians or by the Russians to deceive and confuse the US and its allies. I don't believe that either, nor does Larry Johnson. And I think that, as I said, we should take these documents as true. And we're getting more and more documents, and they're becoming very, very interesting. I mean, we learn, for example, from them that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence organization, the famous Israeli intelligence organization, appears to have had a hand in the protests against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, in connection with the recent judicial changes there. Now, of course, this has been vigorously denied, as have all sorts of other claims which have been made in these documents that refer to third countries. I don't see why people are so skeptical about Mossad's possible involvement in these protests. Anybody who's tracked the history of Mossad will know that, as well as being an extremely ruthless and effective intelligence organization, it's also a highly political one, very much with a mind of its own. And after all, as I also recalled during the protests, the Israeli defense chief timed his resignation or dismissal in the middle of the protests, making it fairly obvious that the Israeli military defense establishment was not in favor of the judicial changes and backed the protests. But anyway, there have been an awful lot of other bits and bobs of information. We learned, for example, that the United States is listening in to President Zelensky's telephone calls. I have to say again, I find that completely unsurprising. And in fact, dare I say it, I would think this was a basic precaution for the United States to take, given how heavily it is investing in Ukraine. But anyway, my overall sense, and I think the gradual overall sense that more and more people are getting about these documents, is that what they show is a bleak and chaotic picture in terms of the progress of the war from Ukraine's point of view. Now, I want to just say one thing before I just talk about that in a little more detail, and I want to be fairly brief. I had assumed until yesterday that these documents had been leaked by Russian intelligence. I'm still not fully persuaded that this is not the case, but the gradual emerging consensus is that they were leaked by some American official, obviously angry and embittered, and that some of these documents were already circulating way back in January. So this is not an entirely new leak, though it's obviously a progressing one. So I just want to make that point. But let's go back to what the documents tell us. Firstly, it's clear that the force that is being built up for this offensive is around 12 brigades. And as Larry Johnson points out, that could number anything between 30 and 60,000 men. Larry Johnson makes the point that doesn't take into any consideration the enormous logistical forces that would be required to support a force of that size. Prigozhin has said that Ukraine has around 200,000 men who could potentially participate in the offensive, and there's another 400,000 in the rear, a significant force. I think that's probably about correct if we are talking about the total size of the Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, the active forces that Ukraine has at its disposal number around 200,000, of whom that 60,000, by the way, is a part, and the remaining 400,000 are the second line logistical supply troops. As we know, there's thousands of women now serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. There's also the people who operate the air defences, who, as I said, do all those sorts of things in the rear. And that the actual teeth units number around 200,000. And I think this is about right. So Ukraine is committing perhaps a quarter of its military to this offensive, which again seems to me about right. It's clear that training is incomplete, was incomplete as of the 1st of March, some of these brigades that have been assembled. It's also clear that equipment supplies have not been up to the necessary levels. There's concerns about this. And indeed, earlier today, I saw some very, very interesting commentaries that the plan by the European Union to provide 1 million shells to Ukraine, supposedly over the course of the year, but as Brian Beletic and I both believe, principally over the next couple of months to support the Ukrainian counteroffensive, that plan has collapsed. The European Union doesn't have that number of shells, or if it does, countries are unwilling to provide that number of shells. There is a general shortage of shells. Production rates are low. It's not possible to keep up with Ukrainian needs for shells. And it's clear that Ukraine is going to launch this offensive without the level of artillery support it perhaps requires. So there's lots of problems there. And in fact, the overall picture strongly supports much of the analysis by people like Alex Vashinin and Brian Beletic and others about the inadequacy of supplies. I'm going to say something else, which is that if the attacking force is indeed going to number between 30 and 60,000, let's say 60,000, that may not be anywhere near enough to achieve any kind of decisive breakthrough, given the fact that Russian forces in Zaporozhye region and Kherson region and the regions nearby are apparently fully up to strength and apparently increasingly well equipped, and given the enormously elaborate fortified lines that they've built up, and given the fact that they will be backed by artillery and aviation, which Ukraine will not be. But of course, this is where we come to the question of aviation, of aircraft, because another report, and it's now widely circulating, and it was commented upon both by the Washington Post and by the Guardian this morning, talks about the critical crisis in the state of Ukraine's air defense system, that Ukraine is running out, or it was running out of air defense missiles, that if the Russians maintain the pace of their cruise missile attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, bear in mind this report was written in February, Ukraine would run out of Buk and S-300 missiles by mid-May, or rather by the end of May. Now that is, in my opinion, confirmation of two things. Firstly, that attack on the energy infrastructure undoubtedly had a multiplicity of explanations, of causes. John Helmer has written another brilliant piece today about the Russian General Staff's preparations for the Ukrainian offensive. He's talked about the Russian cat playing with the Ukrainian mouse. I don't think this is perhaps that far from the truth, but anyway. But Helmer has suggested that the Russians were weakening, degrading the Ukrainian energy system, probing its weak points, so when the right moment came, they could launch a heavy strike on it, which, amongst other things, as well as knocking out the system, would also paralyze Ukraine's ability to move troop trains and send reinforcements to the battlefronts. That's quite possible. By the way, and on that, and in parenthesis, on the topic of the Dnieper bridges, there's now film circulating of a Sukhoi 34 fighter bomber, Russian Sukhoi 34 fighter bomber, launching a guided rocket, a Kh-29 rocket, against a bridge, a Ukrainian bridge, and destroying the bridge. Now, I've previously speculated that the Russians would perhaps use some of their big hypersonic missiles to blow up the bridges. I wonder now, with the Ukrainian air defense system steadily being degraded, whether in fact the plan isn't to bomb the bridges instead with these very big 1,500 kilo precision guided bombs. That's an interesting thought. One wonders how much damage bombs of that size might do to bridges. Again, I don't know. But anyway, putting all that aside, Helmer talks about this, that there would be at some point a major strike on the communication system. But he also says, and I've no doubt about this is the case, and this leak effectively confirms that one of the principal reasons for those missile strikes was to attack a target, the energy system. Ukraine had no option but to defend, depleting over time Ukraine's stock of air defense missiles. And it is clear that the United States is finding it impossible to make up the numbers. It's been trawling all over the world, trying to find replacements for the S-300s and the books, and it's finding it very difficult. It explains, by the way, or so it seems to me, why Ukraine has been, and the US, have been pushing so hard for Greece to give up its S-300 missile system supplied by Russia, based in Crete. Greece has refused. Anyway, the point is that the Soviet-era air defense system is now almost exhausted. There are supplies now of Patriots and Aspides and other systems coming from the West, but they're not apparently as effective or as combat capable as the old Soviet systems were. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but Brian Beletic has explained this. And in the case of the Patriot and the Aspide, there's only a very limited number of missiles that can be supplied because production of these missiles is small. So that is why we are seeing Russian aircraft operating now in larger numbers, increasing numbers, using precision-guided bombs, and they're becoming more effective. And Yuri Ignat, the defense chief of Ukraine's air defense, has actually come out and again has made very bleak assessment of the situation. He was asked directly whether this report about Ukraine's stock of air defense missiles being almost exhausted was true. He evaded an answer. He did come back and say that what he really needs now are not Western systems, missile systems, in which my sense is he has low confidence. What he wants are fighter jets, F-16s. Well, he's not going to get them by the time of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which now is increasingly looking like it's most likely going to happen. either at the very end of April, or perhaps more probably in May. Anyway, there we go. So, critical shortages of air defence missiles. As I said, Helmer discusses this at length, and there's a very bleak assessment of the prospects of this offensive in the London Times, the same newspaper that exposed the crazy Ukrainian scheme back in October to try to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Again, the Times put a bizarrely optimistic, favourable spin on the decision to launch that attack. It suggested that Ukraine expected that the Zaporozhye nuclear power station would only be defended by light infantry. They didn't expect to find Russian armour and artillery located there, even as they were using HIMARS missiles, apparently, to attack Russian positions in and around the nuclear power plant. Why Ukraine would think that is extraordinary, and it does again call into question whether the intelligence system, the satellites, all of that sort of thing, were anywhere near as effective for Ukraine, the ones, that the Americans are supposed to be providing, as legend says. But anyway, I'm not going to go there in this program. Anyway, the London Times, which exposed that story, has now also given what, despite all the strenuous attempts at spin, is an essentially bleak view of the prospects of this Ukrainian offensive. It says that the offensive is very likely Ukraine's last throw. Ukraine does not have enough equipment to keep going much beyond this offensive. The ability of the West to keep Ukraine supplied is running low and will probably be exhausted after the offensive. So this is indeed Ukraine's last throw, and it basically concedes that the prospects for this offensive are highly problematic, and it suggests that it all very much depends now on whether Vladimir Putin supposedly is prepared to risk his precious aircraft in operations over Ukraine. Because if he is, then supposedly the Ukrainian offensive can't work. Well, I think he is. I think we've seen the reasons to see that. I think the Russians are now operating very effectively in their aviation. I think Ukraine will try to move such air defense systems as it has closer to the front lines to try to intercept these aircraft. That will perhaps make them more visible on the open steppe, but that's another story. But of course, Ukraine can't denude its air defences everywhere, because that will expose them to more attack by the Russians, and some of these very new Western systems might not be up to very much either. Anyway, we shall see. But it is an admission from the Times that there are problems with Ukraine's air defense system, that this is Ukraine's last-ditch offensive if it fails, if Ukraine doesn't achieve its military objectives. Well, it doesn't quite say that, but the implication is that Ukraine has lost the war. And that's, again, where we come back to Helmer. Helmer's account, which, as I said, is extremely interesting, essentially discusses this article in the London Times in detail, and it explains very well, as I said, the critical state of Ukraine's air defense, and the fact that, as I said, in Helmer's words, the Russian cat is now playing with the Ukrainian mouse. Now that, of course, leaves open the fundamental question: if Ukraine's offensive fails,